According to an ongoing Newsday investigation, sex trafficking on Long Island is increasing. As arrests of traffickers are going down, fewer victims qualify for mandated services. Some experts say without more aggressive law enforcement, sex trafficking will continue to grow. Investigative reporter Sandra Peddie, a panel of experts, and a survivor of sex trafficking join us to delve into what is happening and why on this Newsday Live conversation. Hello and welcome to Newsday Studios for this Newsday Live conversation about sex trafficking on Long Island. Sex trafficking here in Nassau, Suffolk? Oh yeah, it's happening. Let's take a look at a clip from Newsday's documentary, Tatiana's Story, and hear about sex trafficking from Dr. Santosh Paulus, one of many Long Islanders who knows.
It's happening here in Long Island. Pretty much any town that has more than 20,000 people that live there, you can assume that human trafficking occurs there. There's a heat map that puts kind of like the number of calls that they receive in different parts of the country, and that the 95 corridor lights up. So between
along the East Coast.
East Coast, yeah. If you're selling guns or you're selling drugs, it's a one-time sale, but a person can be sold again and again.
With that, let's meet our panel. My colleague, Sandra Peddie, she's a Newsday investigative reporter. You've been working on this story and continue to work on this story. We have Investigative Sergeant Aaron Mankel of the Suffolk County Sheriff's Department. You speak to sex workers who have been confined in the jail. And we also have Fede Castillo, co-founder of ECLI Vibes. You've worked with women who've been trying to put sex work behind them.
Yes.
Let's start with you, Sandra. You've been on this for a very, very long time. What has your investigation found?
Well, I would say that authorities have seen a dramatic increase in sex trafficking on Long Island, and they saw it because they saw crimes like assault and burglaries and robberies around hotels. And so they've set up programs to address it. But the numbers, which are hard to quantify, but the cases are astonishing.
Well, let me just clarify for just a second here. Is selling and buying sex illegal or legal?
Selling and buying sex is illegal, but it's not a serious crime under our jurisprudence system, and so very few sex buyers are arrested. We've seen a downward trend. In 2013, in Nassau County, 102 sex buyers were arrested. In 2023, there were none.
And why do you think that the numbers are increasing? And when you say numbers, be specific in terms of what numbers are increasing.
Well, I would say that the numbers of women and children who are being trafficked has increased dramatically. A big reason for that is social media. Polaris, the human rights organization which tracks human trafficking across the country, says about 85% of the first contacts that traffickers make with the children they traffic is through social media or Facebook.
And define children for me.
Well, I think a 13-year-old who is sold for sex is a child.
Now, sex trafficking on Long Island kind of came to the fore with the arrest of Rex Heuermann.
Right,
He's a suspect in the murder of 4 sex workers whose bodies were found at Gilgo Beach. But just because we just heard about it right now, does it mean that it just happened right now or 10 years ago when they suspected the first person was killed?
Sex trafficking?
Yes.
No, actually, authorities say that they've seen, and Aaron and Fede can correct me if I'm wrong, but authorities told me in the course of my reporting that they saw the increase around 12 to 15 years ago. They saw this increase of crimes associated with prostitution, and they started tracking it and realized there was a huge increase. Why is there an increase? Because you can make more money if you can contact a girl via social media and you can sell her online, as opposed to putting a girl on the street, being dependent upon the weather, whether there's a football game, having to monitor her. It's much more efficient to book a hotel room and just book a lot of sex buyers for the whatever period you've got the room.
Now, you two have worked a lot with victims, but first, let's hear from Tatiana herself.
I wasn't the kid that was able to run home to mom and dad, you know, and say like you were walking around and you would have saw something and you said something, you might have been able to save my life a long time ago. People see something, they don't say anything, they just talk shit. Oh, you little whore. Little do you know, you know?
Little do you know, she's telling us, but you two, you have some idea, right?
Yes.
Let's start. What are you seeing from the women who are coming to see you?
The same thing over and over again. So what Tatiana explains in her documentary really is not a unique or isolated situation. It occurs over and over again. So the trauma is very at the forefront of what usually ends up for individuals to fall into this life.
And what are you hearing in the jail?
Yes, the same as Peddie mentioned. We do go as far as to ask all of the victims that we speak to a little bit of their background to just see, you know, the similarities. And I want to say at least 80% have had multiple traumas in their history, you know, and a lot of them, unfortunately, also have mental health disorders and things like that. So it just magnifies their vulnerabilities.
Sandra mentioned kids. What are you seeing?
What we're seeing is that the trauma usually starts at childhood. So for Tatiana specifically mentioned that her trauma started very, very early on in childhood. And that's what we see across the board with most survivors that we work with, is that their trauma, child sexual abuse, domestic violence, witnessing domestic violence, being a victim of domestic violence, having a parent that is substance use addicted or has been incarcerated multiple times. All of those are compounded traumas throughout someone's early childhood development that usually ends up kind of almost not forcing them, but influencing them into falling into this type of lifestyle because of what Erin mentioned. The vulnerabilities become greater when you have had these types of severe trauma in your life.
So let's take it back. How do women and girls fall into this lifestyle? What's the process? What do you see?
I think it really goes back to everyone's looking for love and acceptance, you know. So these traffickers are master manipulators and they prey on that. So it just maybe takes a little bit of showing somebody some attention that they don't get because they don't have maybe a good support system at home and things like that.
You say someone, a young woman, a girl is lacking love and attention. What does the trafficker do? What does that look like?
So the trafficker essentially inserts himself or herself into someone's life and becomes kind of like a caregiver, becomes kind of like the individual who then gives the love and the affection, and we call that term love bombing. So in the beginning, it's just like, I love you, you're so beautiful, you're everything to me, you know, we're going to grow this life together, we're going to have children, and the white picket fence and the dream, right? Like everyone's dream. And that's kind of the sell. That's how they kind of like sink their teeth into, because they're predators. That's at the end of the day. That's really what they're doing. And so there's a grooming process. What is that grooming process? It's trust. It's dependency. So they're building this trust and the dependency in the very beginning, so that eventually what ends up happening is that once that individual, the survivor or the victim, falls for it, then it's very likely that they're not going to abandon that idea or that dream, because together they're going to build it together. And that's the illusion, that's the false promises that they build this relationship on. And eventually then they're forced into doing things outside of what they would normally do to obtain that dream.
Okay, but then why do women stay? And for that, we're going to go and take a look and listen to Suffolk Sheriff Errol Toulon.
We're not talking about someone that's doing something on their own. We're talking about people that are forced into this lifestyle, forced on staying on drugs because they're hooked on drugs. There's no one helping them. And if they want more drugs, they have to perform more sex acts. To perform more sex acts so they can pay their trafficker. You know, it's a horrible, horrible cycle.
Erin, the women that you speak to in jail, do they see themselves as victims?
Oh, many times they do not. A lot of times they think that the trafficker is their boyfriend, and that, like Peddie had mentioned earlier, they just want to get to that place in a relationship where they're pleasing that person, so they will just continue trying to do almost whatever the trafficker asks of them just to get in good graces. But a lot of times they don't see themselves as a victim at that moment.
Peddie, Aaron said at that moment, the women that you talk to, do they see themselves as victims, and does that change?
Sometimes, but for the large majority, they don't view themselves as victims. They view themselves as a willing participant. And the reason for that is because through the grooming process, there is this time where it's like the manipulation and the false promises, it's a form of brainwashing. And eventually what ends up happening is that they believe it. And they believe that the only way to achieve the dream that they have now built, that they're going to build together, is to do this thing. And so that's kind of how they feel they've convinced themselves. But we know, as from outside perspective, that that's not how it happens. The vulnerabilities and the trauma leading up to then the false promises, the manipulation, and the grooming process together build on why it's so difficult then for someone to leave, because they've created this psychological dependency on the individual.
Even through violence?
The violence actually solidifies that psychological dependency.
So how do you break it?
Very slowly, and with a really long period of time of interventions and building relationship and trust with the individual. That's really the only way that we can do it, because we know that if their entire life has kind of set them up, because it really has, through the trauma and everything else, has set them up to get to this point, it's not going to be overnight that we help get them out. And I know that just working with individuals for years and just kind of helping to build the trust, the foundation, but also providing the real services, filling the real need, right? Whether it's housing or food or support or counseling, or, just having someone there to be emotionally supportive when you need it. I know that that eventually ends up breaking that trauma bond that they created, because eventually they have something else to look forward to.
What you're describing sounds like drug addiction.
Yes. The psychological dependency looks a lot like a substance use dependency. Trauma bond looks exactly like being dependent on drugs. But it's a person, it's another human being.
So when they're in the jail with you, some women may have drug issues.
Yeah, a high percentage of them. And I know you had mentioned early on in the conversation of why the increase. Well, in 2008 with the opioid crisis that occurred here, that was also another reason why we started seeing the increase, because it created that substance abuse issue. At the jail, we do try to intervene as early as we can and get them set up with Peddie's group, ECLI, for counseling and things like that, because as she said, it is a long process. So the earlier we can get them counseling and connect them with the services that they need, the better chance that they have.
Sandra, where is law enforcement in all of this? Experts say it's not so easy. But before you answer, let's take a look and hear from Suffolk's former chief of detectives, Gerard Gigante.
Prostitution early on was in the streetwalkers. And then it kind of, and it was obvious. And the complaints came in about prostitution in certain areas and community. Since the internet and social media, it's kind of come off the street almost everywhere. So, very rarely you'll see in some communities, it might still exist for certain times of the day, but for the most part it's come off the streets and it's gone into hotel rooms, motel rooms, and also people's houses.
Sandra, in your piece you called it, if I remember correctly, commercial sex. And there's been some discussion or a view that this is a victimless crime. What does your reporting show?
Well, I think there's been a recognition among police and prosecutors over the last 10 or 12 years that it is not a victimless crime, that in fact many of these women are victims, have been victimized, as has been well described by Aaron and Peddie. And so they really are trying to find ways to intervene. They created human trafficking courts in Nassau and Suffolk counties to try to address the needs. But it's a very difficult problem. These cases are difficult to bring. There was a peak of, I think, 77 cases on Long Island in 2017 that had been prosecuted. Now it dropped down to 5 in 2021, according to state data. So the challenge is to put together cases that they can prosecute successfully. And one of the things they say is many of the women are difficult witnesses. They're terrified of their traffickers. And they've also been through this trauma where they've been yanked from place to place. They can't keep their own ID, they can't keep their own phone, they don't know where they're living. It's very, very difficult to, and many of them are addicted to drugs, so it's very difficult to get the kind of corroboration they need for these cases.
And just to clarify, when you're talking about prosecuting cases, who are they prosecuting here?
I'm talking about sex trafficking cases where they're trying to go after the traffickers because they recognize that's the root of the problem. These traffickers can run as many as 15 to 20 women, and some of those women have women they're recruiting. It spreads very, very quickly, and as I said, there are other crimes associated with it. Many of these traffickers are one-man crime waves. They don't just traffic women, they traffic guns and drugs and whatever else they can get their hands on.
How much money are we talking about here? I know you're not going to give me an exact figure, but are we talking about bucks? Lots and lots?
It's a multi-million-dollar industry, if not billion-dollar industry, absolutely.
And we've talked about the women and we've talked about the traffickers. What about the Johns?
Well, that's a tricky question. In 2013, then DA Kathleen Rice in Nassau County announced with great fanfare in a press conference that she dubbed Flush the Johns, where she announced the arrests of 102 sex buyers, because she said it's time to change the culture. But in fact, many of those cases fell apart for various reasons, and there was a huge backlash. And since then, there's been a reluctance to pursue these cases.
Why backlash?
Well, statistically, who are the buyers? And statistically speaking, the buyers are white, middle-aged, usually higher in the socioeconomic status because, you know, purchasing sex is not cheap. And usually they are continual buyers. So they're not individuals who do it once or twice, they are consistently doing, so you have to have the capital to keep up the habit, right? And so these are individuals who, like Tatiana mentioned in her documentary, doctors, lawyers, judges, police officers, etc. These are individuals who are prominent in our community.
And Sandra, okay, so sex trafficking has become less visible, but there's still an impact on communities. What does that look like?
Well, it looks like the crimes you see around hotels. It looks like the crimes committed by drug addicts who need money to buy drugs, because many of these women are addicted to drugs. You see assault, you see, again, gun trafficking, drug trafficking. One of the things that Tatiana said to me that has stuck with me is she said, I felt invisible. I could walk into a grocery store with an old man with grays with his hand on my behind, and you don't think there's something going on? And I think that's the point, is that it's a little more obvious than we know. We just have to know what we're looking for.
Okay, so if you see something, I mean, what can we do?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I do try to always stress when I do presentations, if you do see something, don't try to intervene. I think that's really important. No, you wanted to add something?
And Crime Stoppers, so the police department with Crime Stoppers came up with a number that goes directly to the anti-human trafficking unit in Suffolk County PD. So anonymous completely, they can text it, they can call. And give whatever information they might have that could be potentially helpful for maybe even a case they're already looking at.
So what would that look like for anybody out on Long Island? I'm in the shopping center. What would I be looking for if I were looking something or I happen to observe something?
Well, what Sandra said was really good, right? So you're in the supermarket and you see a very much older gentleman with a younger girl being very inappropriate. that's a red sign. That's a red flag right there. So that's something to look out for. You know, abusive behaviors too. I mean, it does from the outside look like a domestic violence situation, the control, the power, right? And so looking at that might be also something to kind of like, you know, mention or at least keep an eye on, right? A license plate number. Like Erin said, don't try to intervene, but get whatever information you can to gather it. Anything else that I'm missing?
No, I think it, like you said, the control is big. You know, if you
It's a
notice
big deal.
somebody who has to defer to somebody else to answer questions, you know, that's really a key indicator, I think.
Being in hotel rooms consistently, that's a huge one too. Almost all of the sex trafficking that's occurring on Long Island is in your everyday hotel motel, the one in your neighborhood. There is not one that's untouched by this issue.
And I've had people in the past even say, you know, that because they don't believe that it's in the larger, nicer hotels. But it really is every hotel across the island. What happens now, which we see, is the trafficker will rent a block of rooms, and they may be hanging out and partying in one room, selling girls out of another room, and drugs out of another room. And it's such a huge moneymaker that they don't really have to do it at only the small motels anymore. They're staying at the larger hotels.
Did you want to add something?
Well, the other point I would make is that it's low risk for the traffickers. They don't really worry about getting arrested because they don't get arrested very often, and neither do the sex buyers. So it's high profit and low risk.
And it's a renewable resource. You know, if you're selling drugs and there's a raid and your product's taken, now you have to come out of pocket to re-up that product. Whereas if you're selling humans, you're just going to go on social media and get a new one. You know, if that victim gets arrested.
Essentially, that's what happens, yeah.
In a moment, we're going to meet someone who was able to get out. But first, let's listen as Laura Mullen tells her own story.
My trauma began at birth. My mom was a working girl. She had 10 kids by 8 different men. My dad was actually one of her pimps. And it was just, we lived in extreme poverty. I didn't grow up and say, oh, I want to become a sex worker and a prostitute and get trafficked and gang raped and all these things that I've been through. So you're stuck in your life if you're stuck in your life. My mom had passed in 2018, and I just knew I had to be better for my son, because I know it hurt me so much when my mom wasn't here to talk to anymore and stuff. And I knew I had to live for him.
Welcome, Laura Mullen. You are co-founder and president of the Survivor Advisory Board for ECLI Vibes.
That's correct.
That's correct. What goes through your mind when you're watching yourself on the screen?
Oh, I mean, it hurts. It still hurts because I'm still healing. So to see how much pain that I was in, it's almost like brings you back to all that those hopeless feelings again. And then I remember I'm not there anymore. So it kind of turns it around to like, okay, things are better.
We were talking before. You said you feel old. You said you feel like you're in your 80s, and you're not.
No.
So talk a bit about that. Why the disconnect there? Why do you think that is?
I mean, I think it's just because when you go through so much stuff and, you know, your adolescence and your childhood, by the time you become, I was a mother at 16. So by the time you're an actual adult, you already did all the adulting. So I feel like, you know, I'm older than I am.
Well, you heard the discussion before. How would you describe yourself? Do you see yourself as a victim?
I'm a survivor. Yes, I was a victim. Most of my life I was a victim. Do I still feel like a victim? No, but I know I was a victim, but I survived it. I'm a survivor.
You're a survivor. And you mentioned before that you're still dealing with everything that you went through. How do you do that? Because it's like you're living two lives at one time.
Right, so I have a psychiatrist, I have a therapist, and I have a substance abuse counselor. So I do a lot of talking to a lot of people, working through my traumas, starting at the root causes of everything, and really, you know, healing from where it began.
Now, you work with women who, like you, are trying to get away from it. What do you say?
I say that it doesn't have to last forever. You know, that there is hope. You just got to stick out these hard times because it does get better.
Now, these women are coming up in a time different than the time you came up, right? You're in your 30s now, right?
Correct.
Social media was not as big as it is now. What differences are you seeing? And how have you had to educate yourself to help women that you talk to?
I've told some of my younger individuals, like, just deactivate your social media, because there's always an easy way for somebody to find you that way. And that's what we find out, is that a lot of people are contacting these people through social media, but if you don't have the social media, then it takes away that contact. But that makes it really difficult because nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to put their phone even down, let alone deactivate accounts.
Walk me through your process. We heard about your mom died. What was the catalyst?
That was it. My mom died in 2018. I was still out on the streets. I was still doing what I was doing. I was actually a victim of labor trafficking at the time. I was selling drugs for somebody, passing all the money to that person, etc. I got arrested. I met Erin. Erin said, "What's going on?" I said, "Nothing." I lied. And then I met ECLI Vibes, and that's where I broke down to the other co-founder, and I told her what was going on, and she said, "We're gonna help you." And they really stayed there with me throughout my process. And then I went into a program, and then they came to me asking me, you know, "We see that you're getting through this, and we want to know, keep being a part of your life and keep helping you." And that's what they did. They helped me get into my apartment and a bed and all these things, so where I didn't feel like I need to turn around and go back to the things that I knew before.
How many women are you talking to?
I mean, I think we just had a number that went up, that since I became employed there or so, about 3 years or 4 years, like 209 or something like
209?
that.
And describe these women, age-wise. What do we look
I mean, anywhere from 14 to 48. All different races, all different cultures, different backgrounds, different, you know, societal standings, whether that they come from a family that's privileged or a family that's, you know, very poor.
And what's your message to all, if you had to boil it all down to all of them?
Reach out. You got to tell somebody, like, "We're here for you, we'll support you." There are resources, and you got to look for them, and we'll get them to you, and we'll be there for you. It doesn't have to keep going on. That hopeless, dark feeling that you feel inside can turn around and be light.
Do you see yourself as the light, the hope for them?
Oh, absolutely. I think that, I mean, not only have I been told that by some of the people that I've worked with, but I just really try and everything that I do in life to just be that person and be that model of it's going to be okay.
And you heard the discussion before about the rest of us, all of us out here. What would you say to moms, dads, cousins, sisters, strangers on Long Island who don't know and may not see? What message would you give to them? What do you want to say to them?
Stop hiding the abuse that's happening in the home and get your kids the healing that they need, because sexual abuse, domestic violence, substance use, incarceration in the home are all things that lead up to a person being a part of this lifestyle. And if you don't want them to go there, then they need to begin their healing when they're sexually abused by their grandfather at 5 years old. The healing needs to happen, so stop hiding stuff. It starts in the home.
Starts in the home. The panel talked about regular, everyday, run-of-the-mill Long Islanders. If you see something, what would you say to Long Islanders, the residents in Nassau and Suffolk, what to be on the lookout for? What can you do? What can be done?
To be on the lookout for is the girl that's standing in front of the 7-Eleven at 7 a.m. and at 10 p.m., or the person that you drive past the same hotel, motel, and like this person is lingering, or these guys are lingering outside. Like, don't go up to them. There are things to look out for, but if you feel a suspicion, you just reach out to Crime Stoppers. There's so many things to look out for, but it could look like so many different things as well.
What do you want for the women that you counsel?
Oh my gosh, I just want them to have a good quality of life, to feel happy again inside, to not have that hopeless cloud that lingers above most of them for a long time, and heal. I want them to heal.
And that takes time. Thank you, Laura Mullen. And thank you to our panelists, Sandra, Aaron, and Peddie. To learn more about Newsday's investigation about sex trafficking on Long Island, go to newsday.com, where you'll be able to see Newsday's documentary, Tatiana's Story, and to watch video reports on other women who have told Newsday their stories. Thank you for joining us. For Newsday Live Conversations, I'm Joye Brown.